Our previous speaker, Ronnie LeBlanc, spoke without an introduction. Somehow I had got caught up in the book room talking to someone. Who can figure how these things happen? But my apologies to Ronnie for not giving him a proper introduction, but a great talk. Our next speaker. Keith Seland is fresh off his ancient Egyptian and Turkey expeditions. He's just returned. Keith shares data highlights of these treks, then discusses ancient worldwide civilization universals, including their communications, profound spiritualities, cosmic connections, ETs, gods, deities, and similar evolutions from Native America. All the world's ancient cultures recorded stories of Kachinas, star people, ET, and their unique respective deities for our study. Keith connects worldwide similarities between wide-ranging cultural talks about decoding some of these messages apparent in coded Native American petroglyphs. Seland brings over 16 years of UFO science education research work to society in creating the Humaniverse educational platform and authoring 3 titles under the Humaniverse Guidebook series brand. His 2023 and ongoing work will propose that our civilization began detailed preparations for fully globally acknowledged contact and relationships with extraterrestrial intelligences. These include uncovering and broadcasting ever more historical evidence of ET contacts with humankind and emphasizing the role and experiences our ancient worldwide civilizations had with ETs. Keith shows us how modern humankind can learn multiples from our ancestors in these ways and prepare us for global recognition of extraterrestrial intelligence and those future relationships that will be part of our future. You can follow Keith's work through his lectures or a YouTube channel, website, Facebook, etc., under the title of The Humaniverse. Please give a warm welcome to Keith Seland. Yep, awesome. Everyone hear me? Ooh, that's a little better. Okay, I'd like to offer a big thank you to the Kiwanis Club of Exeter, New Hampshire, Bob and Brian and all those people in regards to putting on this charity event, but most importantly you, because without you and your interest, events like this don't happen. So just introduce myself real quick. My name, Keith Seland, as you well know. My talk today is going to center around recent research and my new book, which I'll be coming up to in a couple of slides here. But let's get into the particular topic. Whoops. We'll try that. Let's see if this helps. This is not working out too well. Okay, I'm getting a buzz on here. Okay, big button? Big button, okay. Let's start out. We got a lot to cover here, and if I do have time for some Q&A, I'll be more than glad to help out in that way. If not, I want to remind you that over at the Hampton Inn, there's going to be a meet and greet with the speakers starting at 6 o'clock tonight, so you'll be able to interact and talk with one-on-one all of these speakers that are presenting here this weekend. So the nature of my talk is going to take a deep dive into ancient civilizations and
and aligning them with our current culture in the ways that to help us prepare for a plan of action for not only the first contact with ET, but the relationships that are going to happen as a natural result of those introductions. Incidentally, I am way past the point of if ETI exists. My first two books, as I'll be showing them here in just a second, just one mention about these ancient civilizations. A couple of things that you'll want to keep in mind throughout the talk is to remember that our ancient peoples, our us, and we are them. We're all human beings. We can share the same DNA with each other. They think and thought the same ways on many levels that we do today. So in going through my talk, keep that thing in mind as a few other items here for us. So. Also, too, don't be concerned with having to read lots of memos and lots of letters on my slides. I don't do that. I'm going to have a lot of images and photos. I would like and be most grateful for you to look at the photos and the very few words that are going to be on it, but I'd be very grateful if you would listen to what I'm going to say and not burden yourself with, when you see a full letter, oh my God, I got to read this whole letter while he's talking. That's not the case. So let's move on. Our ancients were very spiritualistic, cosmically connected, and came up separately in their own civilizations with many moral codes, ways of life, spiritual connectedness, spiritual groundedness, ways of life and cultures, even though they lived very far away from each other, and our knowledge today still says that they're not able to have been able to travel to each other's civilizations. So they created their own civilizations and the same universal idea separately. And as part of my talk, can we learn from them? Just real quick, these are my three books. The current title is the one here, oops, that's not working too well. The one on the left in conjunction with my talk today. The first two are the evidence-based and answer the questions if ETI exists. So I'm not even going to say anything more about those. So it's the third one that's going to be of most interest. And we still seem to have an issue with, it's still not happening. There's always going to be IT little minor glitches to work through. There you go.
You just got to commit to pressing the button.
All right, not hard enough. I'll just read this. This is one of the most extensive word slides. Our species has been in contact with ETI since recorded history and reasonably a longer period than that. We can learn from our ancients about preparing for the current and future permanent ET relationships and help our civilization in the process. Some of the themes that I'm going to be talking about that you might want to, thinking points, the universals, as I mentioned, that exist between all the ancient civilizations and us today, the fact that our ancients think in many levels the same way as we do today, we share the same traits. Some of the differences is that they, again, had a very, very high level of spirituality and cosmic connectedness, things that we can learn from, and that's going to be recurring through my talk today. So universals is a very common. Gabe, something's going on here. Oh, we got it. Okay. Very, very good. Okay. All right, awesome. I'll just move on to the next slide. Like I said, our ancient cultures displayed many characteristics and traits alike. Amongst the most spiritual aspects is that they all practiced what I call archaeoastronomy. They were all very connected with the stars and the constellations in the sky. All of our ancient cultures considered the night sky as heaven and hell. So keep that in mind in the next few minutes. Also, too, another aspect, and this is a human aspect which is common to us today, too. A culture reacts to things such as bad weather or famine, lack of food sources and whatnot as existential problems that lead that culture to things such as war or migration, moving in or out. So our ancient cultures had experienced that. All of those characteristics and pitfalls all throughout their existences. So risks to daily life were very important as far as our ancients are concerned, and that tied their thinking into their spiritualism and their moral codes, moral development, a sense of good versus bad, right versus wrong, and whatnot. So to keep those things in mind, here's a good quote. They, meaning our ancients, carefully observed the comings and goings of its bodies. They peopled it with beings whose epic journeys affected the rhythms of their own lives, beings who wove human destinies into the fabric of eternity like the finest Navajo blankets. What I'm going to talk about here is, as Peter introduced to you, I've been having a lot of boots on the ground this year. I just got back days ago from a 3-week expedition in Turkey, as you can see here. I'll point out some of the, that's ancient Troy in the top middle, Karahan Tepe and Catalhoyuk and Göbekli Tepe amongst other sites that I visited. So we will get into that. Thank you for that suggestion. That worked good. Again, the topic points: paleoanthropology, ancient civilizations, universals, the out-of-place architecture or technologies that they exhibited, and they all did to the point where today we don't give our ancients enough credit for the resourcefulness, the ingenuity that they were able to come up and make their civilizations thrive with. I have to thank this couple here. On the left, Dr. Robert Schock, professor at Boston University, longtime researcher, and especially Egypt and Turkey, his wife, Katie here. We were on the Egypt and the Turkey expeditions together, and we will probably continue our research journeys into the next year or a couple of years. We've got some other new trips planned upcoming and whatnot. So a great thanks and shout out to them. As you can see here, one of my trips was to Egypt back in May and June, where we went up and down the entire Nile Valley and took in as many sites and as many observations as we could. I mean, maybe a way to begin the out-of-place architecture discussion and whatnot is to maybe start in Egypt. Very long civilization. Here's the boots on the ground. This is the Bent Pyramid, and we had to crawl through one of many pyramids, this one was about 450 feet long to get to the middle of it. So, Egypt was a very resourceful, very predictable, but staid economy and civilization. They liked the status quo, but again, they developed, whether they had help or not, developed so many new techniques, new advancements to their civilization. And again, we're among the most very spiritual civilizations in the world. They accomplished this evolution by way of these toolkits. These next couple of slides comprise the entire toolkits that Egypt had from the dynastic period beginning in 3200 BCE up until the 0 CE, 1 AD, whatnot. So with these toolkits, Egypt produced things like that. That is Khufu's pyramid in Giza. Give you some fun facts on this. Simple mathematics, 7th grade style, tells you that in a 22-year time period, they were able to construct this thing in the first place. But with a 22-year time period, it would have taken whatever number of people worked on this on a 24-hour, 7-day, 365, 22-year period, they would have had to have quarried, transported, and finally placed one stone, which would weigh anywhere from 3 tons to upwards of 50 tons. They'd have to place one every 4 minutes. How did they do that? Did they have help, or was it just some fantastic coincidence that they were able to produce things like this? The amazement continues. Amongst the quarrying techniques, I'm going to get into this in a second. This is an example of an unfinished obelisk. This is Muhammad, one of our Egyptologists, smart man, and gave us a lot of information. But as you can see here, this was an example of one of the unfinished that Queen Hatshepsut was trying to quarry out to send to her temple, which was about 400 miles down the Nile River. It had a big crack, the image on the right-hand side, so therefore they had to abandon it. But as you can see here, some of these scoop marks in terms of the quarrying, so that just brings up another of these fantastic questions of how were they able to do it? Was it possibly through sound acoustics, quarrying, or engineering? I'm going to bring up this point in just a minute here in a couple other slides, but I want to go to another example here of the out-of-place sacred mathematics, out-of-place technology that they were able to promulgate in their society. You know what this site is. The alignments of the pyramids at Giza correspond to within those dimensions of the true 4 compass coordinates, north, east, south, and west. It hasn't been found that Egypt ever used compasses. Why did they lay the pyramids to this exacting specifications with the toolkit that you just saw a couple of minutes ago, getting to this point? Okay, I think I can go on from there. Another anomalous, and this is where my dear friend Robert Schock comes in. He spent a good part of his career researching and eventually redating the age of the construction of the Great Sphinx. It is his hypothesis, and it's more becoming a theory, that due to his geology expert, the erosion of the stones around the Sphinx, that he has redated the age of the construction of the Sphinx to over 10,000 BCE. So Khufu laid claim to building this, but according to a lot of scientific evidence, again spearheaded by Robert Schock, that this is not in fact the case, that the Sphinx was constructed a lot sooner than that, older than we are taught. This is just an example here. The Egyptian civilization recorded history, coming up in another slide here real quick, started around 3100 BCE, and the primordial period before that extended back a few hundred years, back past the worldwide assumed Great Flood. But civilizations, this is an example of a skeleton that was DNA dated 35,000 years ago. So there were inhabitants in the Nile Valley way back then. Remember, too, one thing that's very important in talking about ancient civilizations is that when you're studying or thinking about them, the most important aspect is that you have to place yourself within their time period. You can't project our today's technology or our today's thoughts or paradigms into the ancients. Now, for example, ancient Egypt 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, the climate is a lot different than it is today. I mean, today it's a desert. It got to 115 degrees some of the days we were out there. But back 4,000 years ago, and presumably 35,000 years ago, Egypt was a very temperate place. They grew all kinds of foodstuffs or whatever. It was a self-supporting geology and self-supporting climate. So, but that's the important part, is project yourself into their time period in order to do some critical thinking about it. As I mentioned, the beginning of recorded history in Egypt, the first pharaoh, Narmer, who unified the lower and upper Egypt to produce one gigantic, thriving Egypt culture. And as you can see, this is his palette, which is one of the most very prized possessions in Egypt history, Egypt museum knowledge, and whatnot. A universal, as I mentioned, there's going to be a lot of them in creating the parallels between ancients and today. All the ancient civilizations think the same way as we do today. Is war very much conscious on our mind today? It was back then, ancient Egypt and other ancient civilizations, Native America and whatnot, that we'll be talking about today. So keep that universal in mind, that they thought the same way as we do today in many ways. And that's where we're going to collect some learning moments and potentials for us today in helping to plan for future in the cosmos, including ETI. So the Ben stone, this is an example of primordial concept, which relates back to the Egypt's version of the Great Flood. It was known that the water covered all of the pyramids and all of the land. The first thing that emerged was these Ben stones, and that's what gives it its spirituality and importance. A couple other fascinating sites here amongst the variety of fantastic, maybe not so much out of place, but the architecture that went on here. This is an example of Luxor. We were able to get there at dusk, so we got some good pictures there. You turn around from that last slide, and you go down the Avenue of the Sphinxes. This is 2 miles long. It's all lit up with sphinxes, and as you can see, the public is able to celebrate. It ends at another temple, the Karnak Temple, that Ramses the Great constructed, and these temples go back hundreds of yards. I mean, just imagine the architecture and the construction, the labor that was used to construct things like that. Of course, no discussion of Egypt is complete without a mention, at least, of the 16th, 17th, 18th great dynasties, King Tutankhamun. That's his mummy and tomb. Its groundswell of support currently, fun fact, is that it's suspected, and there's researchers looking now into the possibility that Nefertiti's tomb, Tutankhamen's mother, exists somewhere in that particular area. Whoops, that just went forward. So, okay, it was somewhere around that, in that back wall that you can see there. Potentially that's a fake wall, but as with everything in archaeology, it's very politically oriented, so you'll see Egypt, you'll see Turkey, and whatnot, that governments and politics play a big part as to whether something gets excavated and increases our knowledge base, and that's one of the damning aspects of how archaeology operates today. So, Queen Hatshepsut, King Hatshepsut, the Valley of the Queens, this was built over 3,500 years ago. I mean, again, the people and the resources and the labor that did something like this. One other king, how you put this, rock star, so to speak, of ancient Egypt, that's Akhenaten. And another universal is that in this example, when Akhenaten fell from power, the society reverted back to its polytheism. Akhenaten was a big proponent of monotheism, and that was so counter to the staid and established and foundational Egypt culture that when he finally got deposed, they wanted to destroy all attributes of him. So as you can see here, everywhere his face would have showed up is actually carved out into whatever, into oblivion. And there's many examples, and even today, let's see. Well, the Berlin Wall. When Germany was all free, the wall came down. Our behaviors today mimic and imitate the behaviors of our ancients back then. Another example that they are us, we are them, we think the same way that they thought. We can learn a lot from them. Some other examples here of great temples. Cappadocia on the upper left, you know what Khufu's home is there. Lower left, that's the Petra Temple, and I believe that's in India, Cadre, I think it is. There's another slide coming up that will mention this, but we're going to switch gears a little bit, and remember these are some of your thinking points as we go through these particular slides here. How were they done? Did they have help? Can they help us today? The Kalish Temple was what I was referring to. Petra in Jordan. I was just there 2 weeks ago, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Angkor Wat, which I may have plans for getting to next year. Those are kind of up in the air. Cappadocia, I was there 2.5 weeks ago. These are mountains in a whole region that were dug out to house a civilization of potentially up to 100,000 people. They still use this concept of construction today. I stayed in a hotel that was dug into the side of a mountain. It was just an awesome experience, but these things last thousands of years. I mean, can you get a wooden house anywhere in the United States to last more than 200 with a lot of tender loving care? So they paid very much attention to their resources, Teotihuacan amongst others, and that's just an example of the worldwide another universal, that great palaces, great constructions all around the world in ancient times. This, circling back to my mention about sound engineering in quarrying and things like that, this is another example of potential advanced technology, advanced thinking that ancient Egypt had. We go back to Khufu. This is a diagram of the inner parts of Khufu here. I want you to look at the King's Chamber and the subterranean chamber. Now, those two are vertically, they're not connected with each other in any ways, but they lie directly above and below each other. So this was the crew that got involved with this particular project. Dr. Schock's crew, including myself, were split up into two groups. And this was a double-blind experiment. We had no scientific designs on anything. This just happened. We were split into two groups. Our Robert is there on the left, and with me and some of my other friends, whatnot. We were in the subterranean chamber. That is 90 degrees below the surface, solid granite. The other crew was in the King's Chamber, 140 feet above ground level, solid limestone. As I was getting ready to take take this photo, I had noticed right before this that I heard sounds. I heard chanting. And with the help of Robert, I quieted everybody down to silence to where we heard our group in the upper chamber, in the King's Chamber, 230 feet through solid rock, chanting Aum, Aum, and it wasn't Aum, it was a normal voice that we could hear them through. And then one of our group in the King's Chamber she was born in Egypt, so she was chanting an Egyptian chant. We heard this for 4 minutes through 230 feet of solid rock. How did they obtain this knowledge to be able to accomplish something like this? Did they have the knowledge? Did they acquire it? Was it a fantastic coincidence? The best, and I ask you, if anybody this weekend can give me the best reasonable, complete explanation as to how sound waves are able to travel through 230 feet of solid rock, please. I've been doing research on this since we got back in June, and the only answers that I can come up with is that inherently in the geology of rocks, especially granite and to a lesser extent limestone, naturally present is quartz. And quartz crystal is a very, very strong sound conductor. But is it enough to promulgate through 230 feet of solid rock. Fantastic engineering. Was it by accident? Did they have help? Did they mean it? They use these chambers constantly. So just wanted to explain that as another out-of-place technological example of not giving our ancients enough credit. Again, one of the overtones is the celestial spirituality, the universals involved. This is the Sphinx. This is looking directly into the west. Turn around, you're looking to the east. Now we're going to get into some paleo-archaeological archaeoastronomy. The next slide should be, yes, that there is more support from the astronomy side to Dr. Schock's theory that the Sphinx was built many millennium before Khufu laid claim to it in 2500 BCE. This is an example of the constellation Leo. On the vernal equinox in approximately 10,697 BC, the moonrise, Leo, rises right over directly in front of the Sphinx. And that doesn't happen there's a wiggle room in astronomy of about 72 years before the precessionary characteristics of the physics of the Earth's motion moves enough away to where it can't be said that the Sphinx is actually looking directly at that. That was roughly 10,697 years ago, give or take. Another fantastic piece of architecture. How done? Did they have help? Moving on, other more deep astronomical aspects. This was from my data collected in Göbekli Tepe just a couple of weeks ago. You're going to see 4 buildings here, an A, a B, a C, and a D. The numbers next to them represent the compass coordinates. And I'll explain those as we go along, but I did want to show you what's important is these are what are called the central pillars. Each building was built with 2 central pillars in place and 1 or 2 rings of peripheral pillars around T-shaped pillars around the back, or again going to it like hinges, so to speak. 1 or 2 rows back, but the central pillars are important. At a compass reading for the A building, 325, for the B building, 348, and moving on, C is 353, D is 347. Those align. Oh, I mentioned this other characteristic. You could look, as you approach these pillars, you can look at them from 2 different directions. You can look at them looking, facing to the, they all face on a north-south general trajectory. You can look at them from the north side into the south, or you can look at them from the south side into the north. Now, my proposal, this is where Dr. Schock has a little different interpretation. He thinks that these are, while they're aligned with the heavens, the constellations, the night sky, he's thinking that they are aligned. You have to look at these from north to south, and what appears in the sky is, again, the night sky and the Milky Way, the Great Rift, is heaven and hell to them. And today, we still kind of in conversations, don't we kind of make that little when we talk about heaven and things like that? Aren't sometimes we looking up a little bit in the sky? Just a human behavior, but it still happens today. So in any event, he was looking at an interpretation of the south sky, Orion and Sirius and whatnot, but it doesn't seem to fit so much with all of the data, all of the evidence. I show these here because these are the fronts of the central pillars for some of the, and as you can see, some of the decorations, the famous God symbol, the H's and the C's around there that you see, or this one here with they kind of look like dodo birds, but they're supposed to be vultures, which has a very important spiritual connection with the transference of the soul of the human body into heaven or into purgatory, where the soul is investigated initiated, and if he's worthy of spending eternity in heaven, he goes into the Milky Way, the Great Rift, and his soul spends eternity in heaven. If not, the soul is reincarnated and cycled back to earth. Another universal, all of these ancient civilizations believed in reincarnation. They all despairingly came up, independent civilizations, with that same idea of heaven, hell, and reincarnation. So, given all of these reliefs on these T stones, the stones are the front is and the back are the very narrow parts. The wide part is the side body, so to speak. So, the front of the T stones here are adorned with reliefs. Given that fact, I'm suggesting that we should be standing in front of Göbekli Tepe, the front, looking to the north instead of to the south. Now, when you look to the north, that's going to make an awful lot more sense. This is a representation of heaven or hell to our ancients. And that's a universal that's pretty logical, pretty obvious, as I'm going to show you more examples of this. Now, back at the time, Göbekli Tepe is presumed to have been built anywhere from around 9700 BCE and existed till roughly in the high 7000s BCE. Dr. Schock has theorized that the Göbekli Tepe was built as a result of the of potential solar activities and plasma activities that caused the melting of the ice sheets, the end of the Ice Age. Then there was a period where there was a warm-up and then another cool down. It was that other cool down that Göbekli Tepe is conjectured to have been constructed. But when we look up in the night sky at these particular times, I just want to give you an indication here. The Earth goes through an astronomical physics-related phenomenon called precession. It wobbles like a top, back and forth. It takes 26,000 years to do this. Consequently, the North Star in our hemisphere changes every couple of thousand years or so. I just want to give you history here. Back at 16,000 or so BCE, Cygnus, Deneb, the swan, the graceful bird, which incidentally is, you don't see it in this photo, but all of these constellations are attached to the Milky Way and the Great Rift, which provide entry points for the soul to actually be transported into heaven or hell. So way back before Göbekli Tepe, we have Cygnus. Deneb is the alpha star for it, but that existed way too soon before Göbekli. Lyra and Vega moved in a couple of thousand years later, and then Hercules, Iota, the eye star, came in roughly at the same time Göbekli Tepe was actually built. As a benchmark example, today Polaris is in Alpha Ursae, and Polaris is known as the North Star. So you take all of these alignments of the central pillars of Göbekli Tepe, and you point to Hercules as the potential point for where the ceremonies and the ritual purposes of Göbekli were created in the first place. Göbekli site is built on top of a mountain. It's not on the side, it's not in the valley. We have the same thought today when we build temples or your dream home or whatever. Your thought is you'd like to build it on top of the hill somewheres to look down on other things. The human beings back then did the same thing with Göbekli Tepe. The valley was sprawling and very widespread and very conducive to agriculture even today. But there was no personal residences at Göbekli, at least that we've uncovered yet. Only less than 5% of Göbekli has been uncovered. The other 95%, with the politics, it's going to take many decades to get it all up. So at this point, the buildings that I just showed you are ceremonial ritual temples only. They they wanted to get as close to heaven as they could to perform their funerary ceremonies and whatnot. So I'm pretty convinced and confident that that's what this was used for, and that the celestial alignments served as roadmaps, so to speak, for them to be able to physically perform their ceremonies. Oh, that's just some notes there. Again, another example, Karahan Tepe, which was conjectured to have been built even 1,500 years earlier than Göbekli Tepe. You're talking 14,000 years ago. And I mean, you could is that going to go back? It's not going to go back. Okay. In any event, nope, it's not going to go back. In any event, Karahan has only been about 2% excavated. But an important difference between the two, Karahan is built on the side of a hill, the top hill in the whole region, but it's built, what we know of it, on the side of the hill. And that's a very distinctive purpose, in that the as you can see here, the buildings themselves, some were bigger than others, different sizes, but different configurations, which leads me to believe that Karahan was actually a residential village in addition to a ceremonial temple, which existed 14,000 years ago. Our definition of Neolithic age has to be recalculated based on the findings from there. Now, hopefully,
of a quick survey of what I can see here at Karahan Tepe, a few of the pillars, not central in nature, do have very rudimentary symbolism, designs of some sort. They're not reliefs of the sort, they just appear to be stones that were broken up through time and then repackaged back together, kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. But this maintains the character of the early amount of research here at Karahan, that not many relief figures have been found, as opposed to later structures such as Göbekli and other sites. It's expected or suspected that there may be 22 or more buildings when the bulk of Karahan Tepe is actually excavated. And as you can see here, they're actually building on the side of a hill. There's a peak up there, as you can see, top of the mountain. So whether this opens up a possible question, whether this is all for celebratory, ceremonial, funerary of a sort, or whether it's possible that there could be actual residences that lived here. As I'm looking down towards the south, if the prevailing winds are from the west, they're going to have to come over this ridge, as you can see here, to come back down. So there is a possibility that findings in the future may indicate that some of these may actually be residences, in addition to various structures like this one that you see here, that may be part of a special ritual, ceremonial, religious aspect of the sort.
14,000 years ago, we're rewriting the definition of what Neolithic times actually mean. So, incidentally, we could not get any closer than the video shows you. There was a University of Istanbul research crew that had taken possession of the entire site and prevented us without any permits from being able to go. So I apologize, but the photos were the best that I could get for you at that time. So, again, that's just another example of the profound cosmic awareness that our ancient cultures had, that we don't have today, that we lost track of. They were very holistic, very spiritual, and I don't mean that in a religious sense either, although that translated very deeply into religion. But you know, in today's lexicon, talk about religion, maybe a taboo subject or whatever. I'm talking about survival and their creation of such moral codes and compasses, the tree of life, tree of knowledge, things like that. So I'll go back here, more archaeoastronomy awareness. This is an image of Ra, the sun god. I've starred this particular dress here. As you can see, this is an example of the Egyptians' fascination with the constellation Orion. In this next slide here, except for the primordial gods, Osiris, Ptah, Ra, and Isis, you see all of the dress and all of the hieroglyphs, all of the images ever created of Egypt have that attribution to Orion. And a lot of them even have the belt signifying the three belt stars, so to speak. So there was an obsession with Orion, and as you can see, there's other examples here going on through. So in ancient Egypt, again, the sky was very important. It represented heaven and hell, but for the Egyptians, Orion, and yes, I know, I see you with the belt is this way or that way. It depends on your perspective and how you look at it. You're going to see, of the millions of them, you're going to see this go both ways. I saw that. So in any event, you can't take away from it. But in any event, another constellation that was very involved with ancient Egypt was the Pleiades. This is the Temple of Hathor, who is the queen of the sky, not the goddess, but the queen, amongst other things, fertility, pleasure, and whatnot. The seven sisters, which is these statues which are out of place and in and of itself. These designs here are, where did they get these figures from? These depictions of what they were, but the symbolism is out of place. And again, another example here. Where did these images, these symbols for these beings come from? This is anomalous in and of itself. This has more attributions to a Hindu culture than it does to Egypt, and this is the only place in Egypt that you can see that. But this is an example of the Pleiades star cluster, and this permeates all through the Hathor temple and funerary place, her tomb, so to speak. As you can see, the many examples, these are along the ceilings, depictions of the night sky, the stars, and whatnot. And as you can see, these were all drawn with all of the labor hands that helped in the design of the temples for her. So, let's see here. Okay, one other real quick, and it's actually going to be a debunking on my part. I'm pretty pragmatic in nature. You don't know me very well for right now, but if I'll call something as I see it, and this has to do with the Dendera Temple. If those are the light bulbs, those of you that may have heard of the idea that's been popularized. This is an example of a light bulb that supposedly had a battery to it and answered the questions, how did the Egyptians be able to see in the dark to build their temples and constructions and into their tunnels and things like that? Well, it's a light bulb. Unfortunately, my answer is that no, it isn't. It's a little difficult to see here. You might be able to see better on the top one. This, now I had asked you before to remember the image of the Milky Way, the Great Rift that I showed you a few slides ago. The Dendera Temple, this to me is an example of the Milky Way, Sagittarius, the Great Rift, complete with the hook that comes around on the top. Right underneath the hook is a depiction of the goddess Nut. The goddess Nut is the goddess of the sky, which runs counter to ancient civilizations. Most of the time, it's the male king that is the god of the sky. In Egypt, she is the goddess of the sky. She is seen holding up the Great Rift, the Milky Way galaxy, heaven and hell. Next to her, in front of her, those four horizontal lines, that's an example of the Djed pillar, which is attributed back to Osiris and has the indications of stability, support, foundation that is assisting the goddess Nut in holding up the universe, heaven and hell. And then there's other depictions along the way here, as I see here, Amun, Horus, Sobek, and Ra, the other primordial gods. Well, Horus wasn't primordial, but in any event, there's 8 of these Dendera bulbs, which, that's my interpretation. They're not light bulbs. There's more reasonable explanations as to how the Egyptian workers lit up their tunnels and their workplaces to be able to dig out into their temples and whatnot. So just throwing that out at you. Another universal, ancient civilizations, the funerary celebrations, ceremonies, rituals, and whatnot. Mummification, which was kind of unique to Egypt. And I think for lack of time, if you want to ask me more about mummification, I'll be here all weekend and at the meet and greet tonight. So I want to move on just a little bit here. So also okay, this is not so much important. Cynocephaly, which is example of the human body and an animal head. And as you can see, this is the Anubis god tending to the body of a pharaoh, preparing him for his eternal life and trip into the heavens. There's no etymology for this particular because it's got a human head and an animal body. There's nothing in the language that indicates anything more description about that. They were also very obsessed with deifying animals. Baboons, crocodiles, boars, thunderbirds, which are coming up here in just a second. But the Hathor mythology we've already gone through. Again, those figures just seem out of place. And yeah, the conversation comes up all the time that, oh, this was all a shamanism and chemical concoctions and cocktails and things like that. Not everything that comes through to being displayed can be answered by shamanism. There are other more reasonable, more down-to-earth 3D answers than to say that it was ayahuasca that made the creators draw the figures that they have on there. So again, these are the very important, as you can see here, the constellations. And as you see here, the Great Rift and the button hook, is that Dendera or not? The light bulb. So in any event, let's move on here. Okay, this is just a list here of various ancient cultures around the world and why they depicted the things that they did, why they put their writings and scribed their glyphs and whatnot. I'm just going to click through all of these. Most of the time, these temples and shrines were for use of royalty only. But in some cultures, such as I believe Mesoamerica and North America, the Native Americans, their glyphs were on display for the public to interface with and use. But most of the other cultures, the public wasn't even allowed in Egypt or in the Norse or Sumeria. Those glyphs and scribes and everything were just for royalty. Again, devotional practices were very profound and things that we can learn from them today. Another universal is the Thunderbird, which is going to morph us into a discussion about Native America, in which I had spent parts of the last 4 years going through mostly the Southwest United States. Petroglyph fields, panels, being able to learn the ideographic language and decoding and whatnot. So this next part of the discussion is going to be about petroglyphs. I'm hopefully going to be able to show you a little bit of being able to decode when you go up to a panel. I encourage you, there's thousands of panels that are open to the public, and if you have any interest in it, take a trip out to one of these panels. They're not miles out in the desert, but you'll get an appreciation from what I'm about to tell you about maybe being able to interpret a little bit of petroglyphs. Why were they created? And basically the one sentence, to appease seen, unseen, and or deified forces that filled the civilization's life with uncertainty, war, tension, terror, whatnot. And again, common human characteristics: when there's famine, when there's war, when there's bad weather, those are three indications that human beings are going to either move away from that, migrate, or go to war with each other, or do whatever to solve the basic problems that are presented to them. And the ancients translated that into a very spiritual, extensive knowledge and practice of gods, deities, and the visits from E.T. I'll quickly take you through here. These are some drawings. As you can see, the dates here. Chauvet Cave is also in France. Some of these drawings go back over 30,000 years. Armenia, in which they're potentially, not next year, but I might be tripping there in the next couple of years. In Peru, which possibly could be next year as part of a trip. Australia also. I mean, look at these figures. Look at these depictions in the glyphs and the graphs and everything. A lot of these beings are not Göbekli Tepe. I mentioned the vultures here, and the spiritual connection with them and the soul is that the vulture took the dead person's body, or it took his soul and transported it up into the heavens. Now you remember Cygnus, and you remember Deneb, and you remember Hercules and Corona Borealis as gateways and entry points into the Milky Way and the Great Rift. So that was the path to heaven. The vulture was the designated animal god that did that. More depictions from around the world. Again, this is universal. This is Greece. I think we've touched on all 6 continents right now. But back to America, back to the United States. There's 3 types of glyphs: petroglyphs, pictographs, and one other, which is geoglyphs. The main difference between petro and picto is that pictos are painted on, petroglyphs are pecked in. They are gouged into the rock. And all of these things, all of these types exist. The geoglyphs, there are some in the U.S., but most of them are outside, which will be for another discussion. Egypt was an example. They used all 3 of those: hiero, petro, and pictos, whatever. And these are some examples of from Native America that I've found of potentials with ETs. I'll mention this story in just a minute, but here's some others. Again, their preoccupation with depicting ideographs, symbol stories about war, and great hunts was also a topic here, and the spirituality. As you can see, the stars, and then there should be a couple other, well, they'll be coming up here. Why glyphs? As I just mentioned to you before, they helped relieve or solve their problems of tension, terror, and existentialism. So they were real threats to them. The different types through a chronology of styles of petroglyph rock writing that exist. This is the earliest known, were known as the archaic people. They existed in mostly Utah and Arizona from about 8,000 BC till about 2,000 BC or so. The next is the Barrier Canyon, which is the weird example, if you've seen on the Ancient Aliens TV show and whatnot, these pictographs of these very spiritual figures. And I'm going to describe a little bit more about this in just a minute, how to interpret a panel. The basket maker, there were 3 versions of it, and they were mostly existed in the 4 corners, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, and they lasted anywhere from the roughly 2000 BC until about 1200 AD. So a lot of them coexisted. The Fremont culture is pretty unique to Utah, and again, this is an example from Sago Canyon, which I'll go into in just a minute. The Fremonts existed at the same time, similarly as the Barrier Canyon, and the beginnings of the basket maker, and also, I'll mention this, the spirit ghosts at the top, in a second when we get into an analysis of interpreting glyphs and whatnot. The Anasazis, the other very important one, coexisted with the Fremonts and the basket makers, and again, all throughout the southwestern United States. And and the Utes began their Pueblo existence roughly about 1200 AD. So let's go into the dynamics of rock writing, communication. They're communication, they're not art. And even archaeologists are guilty of putting in titles of their books. Rock Art of the Southwest by Dr. Polly Shaftsma. She puts on page 31 a disclaimer, oh yeah, I know that this is not art, blah, blah, blah. Well, why do you name the title of your book art? It's communication in a very sophisticated form of it. One symbol can mean 1,000 words or more. Context is very important, and there's various dimensions of context, cultural or symbol usage within the story itself. A symbol can mean slightly different things depending on the context of the story. The purposes as to why symbols and glyphs were made, obviously either to identify, to describe, or to create value within the glyph or the panel itself. I'm not doing much of any research in creating value. I'm more interested in the pure communications and their attributions to what they were actually describing and experiencing and whatnot. Another universal in which human beings today practice the same behaviors. All ancient civilizations scribed what they saw, including us today. When we have UFO experience, UAP experiences, and sightings and whatnot, we're only describing what we saw. Our ancients did exactly the same thing. So when you see these glyphs, for example, this is the zodiac in Egypt, a depiction of the night sky, and cargo cults, which is a modern day phenomenon, which you can ask me about this later. I don't think I have time to go into this, but it's just an example of current humans just manifesting what they saw into telling their particular stories. Another very important aspect, I mentioned the moral, very high moral compasses and moral codes that all our ancients were practicing. A universal is the tree of life, tree of knowledge. And this existed all throughout Egypt and, like I said, all worldwide civilizations. Real quick mention of the ideographic writing system. It's a two-step language of the mind. Today we have language as the third step. When our senses accumulate an image of some sort, step one is receiving the image, two is perceiving it. The third step with using language is that we have to translate that into words to create the language. Ideographs don't do that, which is why the petroglyphs and glyphs exist. It's a two-step thing. The symbols mean things, and they can differentiate if the symbol means something different than what normally it does. They only need to be able to receive the stimulus and process it in their brains. They don't need to translate it into the language. We have that today. Go outside, I see a stop sign right outside here. It's got stop on it, but you get the idea. Men's and women's rooms or whatever. That's examples of videography. Semiotics or sign language, which is actually developed from this. So let's into decoding techniques and attributes. There's a few here. I've tried to capsulize them as best as possible. There's the dimension of the glyph context, the cultural uniqueness in the symbols. There are very many universals in the Native American symbol catalog, but there are some differences amongst different tribes. Temporal considerations and the geometry or sacred mathematics and rock writing. For the glyph context purposes, why did they create these? They're telling stories on a particular panel. To landmark very important life events, not usually the mundane day-to-day stuff. The landmarks themselves, often they're used as geographic markers. If a passerby needs a source of water or food, the directions will be given on a particular panel and they can move around to it. Great hunts and war stories, which ties in with the other two, and of a spiritual cosmic nature. And as you can see, these disparate cultures all over the world came up with commonalities, the pyramid concept, temporal considerations in situ. Now this is, oops, let me go back here. This is the example to where you've got a panel. This is the best description of this. One panel will contain stories that could span over hundreds of years. They had a limited supply of writing, scribing material. So what they would do is tell their story on part of the panel. As you can see, maybe up at the top here, see those dark maroon, very dark symbols of spirits and whatnot. Those were done at a time before the rest of the story or stories was actually written. So when they had a story to tell, they didn't tend to use the whole panel. They just used a part of it, and as time went on, that same tribe continued to use to fill up a panel, and then sometimes they just wrote over it. You'll see more recent glyphs right on top of other older ones. So that was a very common practice that they use, which makes it a little more difficult to be able to decode and interpret. As I mentioned, the sacred mathematics, all the ancient civilizations adorned the use of geometry. The circle represents cycle, represents life, death, rebirth, and they all used it. Other dimensions here, at least in Native America, Earth was usually depicted by the mother gods. The sky was depicted by the father gods. The compass directions from north, east, south, and west represented the cycle of one particular life, and then a rebirth and a cycle continuing on through. And the colors also meant some things too, and I'll give you an example of that coming up. Other attributes to being able to interpret glyphs of a kind involve torso attributes, star maps, which again Native America was very extensive in using those also, and trying to find the entry point for the glyph, which is it's like a jigsaw puzzle. You got to get those first two pieces put together before you can move on. That's usually the longest, and then you can find it's easier to put the rest of the puzzle together from that. So that's very important. Torso attributes. You can see the busy work that's involved inside of a particular torso here, and also too, one other thing is that they had to incorporate three-dimensional depictions into two dimensions. So they would use the resource of size and distance, and that represented typically that the one in the distance was either older than or of less importance than the main picture in the foreground. And that actually goes to help to identify the glyph starting point, is if you find the biggest figure in the particular panel that you're looking at, often you'll be able to get the starting point. And I'll come back to that one in a second. But again, they had extensive use of the sky and the stars. Again, for them it was heaven. So the glyph story entry point, as I mentioned, this is what we're going to be looking at here in just a second. Okay, I'll just go through this. An example of some of the stories that relate to potential ETs and whatnot. I came upon this. This was an example. It's a one-off story. A crow was depicted as the smartest, and the raven as the smartest animal bird god in Native America, and that's a universal. The parrot or the crow or the raven in this example, he's talking, and the crow and the raven were known as warning beacons, so to speak. They would tell the human beings, hey, something troubling is coming up or whatever, and that's a universal. In this particular panel, the crow was talking, warning of, that looks like a spaceship. And I'm trying to be pragmatic here by saying, okay, that could look like a tornado, and tornadoes can exist anywhere on the earth. They typically don't exist there, but that doesn't even look like a tornado. There's too many attributes to potentially a ship or a craft of some kind. Here's other examples. Another universal with Native American glyphs. When they depict a human being or an animal upside down, that's an indicator that they are deceased. So another universal is with this circle where their head should be, basically says that this person was stupid in the event that caused the death of that person. So then as you look over here, you see what looks an awful lot like an ET. And the only part that I can't really decipher is in this middle here, because it's been chipped away by geology and time and whatnot. It could describe some kind of a path or a meeting which may have caused this particular person's death. That is very old, by the way. I estimate that to be about 3,500 years old. Here's other examples of anomalous things that could describe to do with spiritual nature, ET. This is another example of a dead person who has maybe made a mistake by climbing a mountain and coming back down again when he should have stayed on the top of the mountain. So this then tells the story that this particular person had passed away, and instead of climbing the top of the mountain, where that image there is of a tortoise, which is known and as a universal to be a sign of long-lasting life, stable and whatnot. The spiritual aspects of it, this person's particular soul could have been raised up into the stars. That the three arrows and the dot signifies another universal in Native America, the Great Spirit. So this person's soul is depicting in the story that it is being carried by the Great Spirit, and potentially a craft of some kind, as you can see the kind of disc-shaped. And then on top of that are those wavy lines. The deceased person's soul was carried up into heaven, which is the Milky Way, the Great Rift. Real quickly, it's groundswell of support that Aztec and the end of the Mayan civilization, that some of them did migrate up into southwest United States. This is an example of... Okay. Oh, there we go. Up in McConkey, this is very difficult to see, but it's a depiction of what looks like an alien being or a morph creature of some kind. So I'll just touch real quickly. I'm going to speed ahead here as I'm running out of time, but I mentioned the Tree of Life, and this is from Sago Canyon. This is the main panel in which I mention here, this just describes a potential war between this alien-looking creature, his cohort, which was an older person or someone. As you can notice, the use of color, they're both depicted red. That's one side of the battle. These are depicted in brown. This is the other side of the battle. And the largest figure here happens to be the superior god or ET or whatever to describe the story. I'll just leave it at that for right now. We can talk about that later if you want to stop by my table or at the meet and greet. The Tree of Life, a very important aspect of ancient civilizations and Native America. It's a universal in which it's basically a moral compass which guided their lives and their critical thinking and their existences. As you can see here, the Hindus, the Bodhi tree was important. Egypt, the flower of life. Christianity, Judaism, the Kabbalah, and the universal theme of good versus bad permeates all of humankind all throughout history. Universals. There's another Native America version, the Tree of Life, which I will run through this here. The dimensions of the Tree of Life, it was hoped that a righteous and good person, in order to obtain nirvana, so to speak, or eternity, his soul to live in eternity, these were all the dimensions of the Tree of Life with which they should be the living to give their soul the best chance of going into eternity. And as you can see, are all of these, do we all practice all of these today? The interconnectedness between them. The tree of life, and as I'll show you here, this was on a panel I discovered in Sago. Native America believed that the fourth cycle of life, they rose from the earth into the terrestrial world. The tree of life then gives the directions, the blueprint, the moral codes with which them to live their lives. This is a person that was rising up out of the earth world into the terrestrial world, seeking the tree of life, that knowledge that will allow his soul to be successful and exist. This is another example of another person seeking out the tree of life, tree of knowledge, in terms of being able to successfully transfer their soul into a higher realm, into eternity. There are astronomical alignments with these. Real quickly, it's potentially that this tree of life was imparted on this particular tribe from potentially any of these constellations in the night sky in the northern hemisphere here. I'll just go on by that. Okay. I think I'm pretty much towards the end here. Yes, I am. Just as a follow-up and a summary type of a thing here, we need to learn from our ancestors about practicing both an earthly and cosmic existence. ET is waiting for us to develop these traits before they make permanent, lasting contacts and relationships. Let's see here. Okay, those are my books, but I just want to say that we have a lot to learn from our ancients. The way we're living today, and I'll just leave this to you and the individual of your own thoughts. Do you think that you could have a better life if we would start practicing a little bit more about getting along, being a little more concerned and caring about our environment? Even if you don't believe in ET and any of this other stuff, if we start practicing a more holistic life in our day-to-day, we're hurting our planet. Global climate change is undeniable. It's significantly factored by human beings and our actions, our runaway technology, that we invent something, we don't know, learn how to use it, and create 3 more problems for one being answered. Deforestation, which is the chemical constituency of denying trees to be able to manufacture the oxygen with which to fight a polluting atmosphere. The wars that we constantly fight between ourselves, individually, the groups that we're part, socio-political, whatnot. In the individual of your own thoughts, do you think you might be able to achieve a better and a happier life? And that could be a very big reason why ET isn't making themselves known to anybody except the military-industrial complex or the military throughout the world, is that maybe we're not totally, entirely ready yet. But in the same way, if we start practicing and adhering and maybe following some of the blueprints that were laid out to us by our human ancestors, we are them, they are us, do you think maybe that we could create a better life for ourselves and better plan for ET's coming? Basically, that's all I had. These are my books. Like I said before, they'll be available all weekend. Oh, that's me. Okay, in a moment. Pretty good photographer there. That's all I got. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your attendance. Without you, this isn't possible. Okay, Gabe. All right, Peter, how did you do this? I'm more comfortable holding the microphone than... You know what? No, it's not.